My ex-husband told me I was too damaged to ever find real love again. He didn't know my teenage son was recording him through the baby monitor we'd forgotten about. But what happened when my son played that recording to my fiancé, a federal judge, made my ex's world crumble in ways he never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Martinez, and for most of my adult life, I believed the lies people told me about my worth. I live in a charming brick townhouse in Richmond, Virginia, the kind with ivy climbing the walls and a small garden where I grow herbs for the local community kitchen. To my neighbors, I'm the woman who organizes book drives for the literacy center and bakes empanadas for every block party. But behind my front door, I spent years rebuilding myself from the wreckage of a marriage that nearly destroyed my sense of self. My story begins not with love, but with the absence of it. For 12 years, I was married to Marcus Rivera, a man who could charm a room full of strangers but couldn't find kindness for the woman who shared his bed. Marcus worked in corporate finance, the kind of job that came with expensive suits and even more expensive opinions about everyone around him. He had this way of making you feel like you were lucky to be in his presence, even when that presence felt like a storm cloud that followed you through your own home. When people ask me what went wrong in our marriage, I used to say we grew apart. That's the polite answer, the one that doesn't make dinner parties uncomfortable. The truth is messier, darker, and took me years to even admit to myself. Marcus didn't just criticize me. He systematically dismantled my confidence, piece by piece, until I couldn't remember who I'd been before I became his wife. He started small, the way emotional abuse always does. Comments about my cooking that weren't quite complaints but weren't compliments either. Suggestions about my appearance that felt like improvements but landed like criticisms. Questions about my friends that seemed caring but gradually isolated me from everyone who might have reminded me of my worth. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd become a stranger to myself, living in my own home like a guest who wasn't quite welcome. Our son Diego was 8 when I finally found the courage to leave. Diego is nothing like his father, thanks God. Where Marcus was loud and dominating, Diego has always been thoughtful and observant. Even as a child, he had this way of watching people that made you feel seen, really seen, in the best possible way. He inherited my curiosity about the world and my stubborn streak when it comes to protecting the people he loves. The divorce was brutal. Marcus fought me on everything: custody, finances, even the small things that didn't matter to anyone, but seemed to matter to him simply because they mattered to me. He hired an expensive lawyer who specialized in making women look unstable. And for months, I felt like I was drowning in legal documents and court dates. But I had something Marcus didn't expect. Diego, who even at 8 years old, understood more about truth and loyalty than his father ever would. The custody arrangement gave Marcus every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. I dreaded those handoffs, the moments when I had to stand in my own driveway and pretend to be civil while he made subtle digs about my appearance, my parenting, or my future. He had this way of speaking to me like I was a child who'd disappointed him, his voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension that makes you want to disappear. The worst part wasn't the insults themselves, it was the way they lingered. Hours after Marcus left, I'd find myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, searching my reflection for evidence that he might be right. Maybe I was too difficult. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe I really was the problem in every situation, just like he'd convinced me during our marriage. But Diego saw through all of it. Children have this remarkable ability to cut through adult nonsense and see straight to the heart of things. He never said much about his father's behavior, but I could see it in his eyes. That quiet disappointment when Marcus would show up late for his visitation, or the way Diego would hug me extra tight after particularly difficult handoffs. As the months turned into years, I slowly began to remember who I was before Marcus. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching English to new immigrants. I joined a hiking group that met every Saturday morning at sunrise. I learned to cook dishes from my grandmother's recipes that I'd abandoned during my marriage because Marcus preferred bland, predictable meals. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a life that felt like mine. Diego flourished too. Away from his father's criticism and constant need to control every conversation, my son bloomed into this incredible young man with opinions and dreams, and a sense of humor that could make me laugh until my sides hurt. He started playing guitar, writing poetry, and asking questions about the world that reminded me how beautiful it could be when you weren't constantly defending your right to exist in it. But Marcus couldn't let go. Even years after our divorce was finalized, he found ways to inject himself into my peace. He'd show up unannounced, claiming he forgot something from his old house. He'd call with urgent questions about Diego that could have waited for our scheduled check-ins. He'd make comments about my choices, my home, my life, as if his approval was still something I was supposed to seek. The hardest part was watching Diego navigate his relationship with his father. My son loved Marcus despite everything, the way children love their parents even when those parents don't deserve it. But I could see the toll it took on him, the way he'd come home from visits looking tired and smaller somehow. Diego never complained directly, but he'd ask questions that broke my heart. Why does Dad always seem angry? Why does he talk about, "You like that? Why can't he just be happy that we're happy?" I didn't have good answers for those questions. How do you explain to a child that some people are so uncomfortable with their own pain that they need to spread it around like a virus? How do you help them understand that their father's inability to love well had nothing to do with them and everything to do with wounds that Marcus refused to heal? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 years after our divorce, something shifted in Marcus. Maybe it was seeing me rebuild my life, or maybe it was his own loneliness catching up with him. But his comments became sharper, more personal, more designed to hurt. He'd make jokes about my age, my prospects, my chances of ever finding someone who could tolerate me long term. He seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding me that damaged goods didn't have a long shelf life in the dating world. I tried to let it roll off me, but the truth is, his words found their mark more often than I wanted to admit. Dating. After divorce is terrifying under the best circumstances, but dating after emotional abuse feels like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Every new person I met felt like a risk I wasn't sure I was brave enough to take. What if Marcus was right? What if I really was too broken, too complicated, too much work for anyone to love properly? Those doubts followed me everywhere. When I'd catch someone looking at me at the grocery store, I'd wonder if they saw what Marcus saw, someone fundamentally flawed and difficult to love. When friends tried to set me up on dates, I'd find excuses to cancel, convinced that disappointing them later was better than facing rejection now. Marcus had planted seeds of doubt that grew like weeds in every corner of my self-worth. But Diego saw all of it. He watched me shrink back into myself after particularly cruel comments from his father. He noticed when I'd stare at my phone for 20 minutes, afraid to respond to a text from a potential date. He saw me practicing conversations in the mirror, trying to figure out how to explain my past without sounding like the victim Marcus had convinced me I was. One evening, after a particularly difficult custody exchange where Marcus had made some comment about my expiration date in front of Diego, my son found me crying in the kitchen. I was supposed to be making dinner, but instead I was just standing there, holding a wooden spoon, and wondering if Marcus might be right about everything. Diego didn't say anything at first. He just walked over and hugged me, his arms reaching, almost all the way around my waist now that he was growing tall and lean like his grandfather. Then he pulled back, looked me straight in the eye and said something that changed everything. "Mom, Dad's wrong about you. He's wrong about everything. And someday, someone's going to see you the way I do, and Dad's going to feel really stupid." That night, something shifted in me. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to remember that my 13-year-old son could see my worth, even when I couldn't. Enough to realize that Marcus's opinion of me had exactly as much value as I chose to give it. Enough to start believing that maybe, just maybe, there was still time for me to write a different story about what my life could look like. I didn't know then that Diego was right. I didn't know that love was coming, or that it would arrive in the most unexpected way, wearing a judge's robes and carrying a heart big enough to hold all my broken pieces until I could put them back together myself. I didn't know that Marcus's cruelest predictions would become the very thing that revealed his own emptiness to everyone who mattered. All I knew was that I had a son who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, and sometimes that's enough to start building a life worth living. I started dating again on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday held any special significance, but because that's when Diego looked up from his homework and said, "Mom, Mrs. Chen from next door asked if you're single because her nephew David is a doctor, and apparently makes really good pasta." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this information, like he was reading the weather forecast, made me laugh for the first time in weeks. "And what did you tell Mrs. Chen?" I asked, setting down my coffee mug. "I told her you're awesome and any guy would be lucky to have you, but that you're scared because Dad made you think nobody would want you." Diego said this without looking up from his math problems, as if he'd just solved an equation instead of laying bare the truth I'd been trying to hide from myself. Out of the mouths of babes. My 13-year-old son had become my accidental therapist, and apparently, he was better at it than the actual therapist I'd been seeing for 6 months. That conversation launched what I now call my rehabilitation into the world of romance, a process that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. I started small. Coffee dates that could be escaped easily if things went south. Lunch meetings that had built-in time limits. Dinners only after multiple successful interactions that proved the person across from me was genuinely kind and not just performing kindness to get what they wanted. The first few dates were disasters, but not for the reasons I expected. I kept waiting for red flags that didn't come, preparing for criticism that never materialized, bracing for the moment when these men would reveal themselves to be Marcus in different packaging. Instead, I discovered that my Marcus detector was so finely calibrated that I could spot manipulation from 3 conversations away. The emotional abuse I'd endured had given me an unexpected superpower, the ability to recognize genuine kindness because I knew exactly what its absence felt like. David the doctor was lovely, but talked exclusively about his CrossFit routine. James the teacher was sweet, but still lived with his mother and seemed to be looking for a replacement rather than a partner. Michael the accountant was funny and smart, but spent our entire dinner explaining why his ex-wife was crazy. A conversation that made every cell in my body scream, "Run." But something beautiful was happening through all these mediocre dates. I was remembering how to laugh with strangers. I was practicing the art of conversation with people who weren't looking for ways to diminish me. I was learning that I could be charming and interesting and worthy of someone's time and attention. Each coffee, each lunch, each awkward goodbye hug was rebuilding my confidence one interaction at a time. Diego was my biggest cheerleader through this process. He'd wait up for me after dates, not because he was worried about my safety, but because he wanted to hear the stories. "Tell me about the weird thing this one did," became our ritual. I'd make us hot chocolate and regale him with tales of men who wore socks with sandals, talked to waiters like they were servants, or spent 45 minutes explaining cryptocurrency while I nodded politely and planned my escape. "You're getting pickier," Diego observed one night after I'd described a perfectly nice man who just hadn't sparked any interest. That's good. Dad always said you had no standards, but really you just had the wrong standards. You were trying to make him happy instead of trying to be happy. Again, my teenager was dropping wisdom that took me decades to learn. When had he become so insightful? When had he started seeing patterns that I was only beginning to recognize? I realized that Diego had been watching my journey toward self-worth with the same careful attention he'd once watched his father's behavior. But instead of learning Marcus's lessons about power and control, Diego was learning mine about resilience and growth. The turning point came 6 months into my dating adventure, on a rainy Thursday evening at the community center. I was there, for my weekly volunteer shift, helping with the citizenship test prep class, when I met Judge Harrison Montgomery, though I didn't know he was a judge at first. I just knew he was the tall man with kind eyes who'd shown up to help translate documents for the Spanish-speaking students. Harrison was different from the beginning. He didn't try to impress me with stories about his career or his accomplishments. Instead, he asked questions about the students, about the program, about what drew me to volunteer work. He listened to my answers like they mattered, like I was saying something worth hearing. When old Mr. Ramirez struggled with a practice question about the Constitution, Harrison didn't jump in to correct him. Instead, he waited patiently while I worked through the explanation, then added gentle encouragement that made Mr. Ramirez beam with pride. We fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Harrison would arrive early to help set up chairs. I'd bring extra coffee for the volunteers. We'd work side by side, helping students navigate the complex requirements for citizenship, and somewhere in those quiet moments of shared purpose, something beautiful began to grow. Harrison told me he was a judge on our third coffee date, delivered with the same casual tone someone might use to mention they worked in accounting. I spend my days listening to people's stories, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. The sad ones, the complicated ones, the ones where there's no clear right answer. It makes me appreciate the simple beauty of people choosing to help each other, like what we do at the center. I was intimidated at first. A federal judge? What would someone like that want with someone like me? But Harrison had a way of making his impressive career seem like just one part of who he was, not the most important part. He was more interested in talking about his garden, his love of old movies, his failed attempts at learning to play piano as an adult. He made me feel like my own interests, cooking, reading, volunteering, were just as valuable as his legal expertise. The first time Harrison met Diego was accidental. I'd forgotten about a school event and had to pick up my son from debate. Team practice while Harrison and I were having coffee. Instead of cutting our date short, Harrison asked if Diego would like to join us for ice cream. I watched nervously as my son sized up this new man in my life, but Diego's natural curiosity won out over his protective instincts. "So you're a judge," Diego said, not as a question but as a statement requiring confirmation. "I am," Harrison replied. "Federal court, mostly civil cases, some criminal. What do you think about that?" Most adults would have launched into some sanitized explanation of what judges do, but Harrison waited for Diego's response like it was the most important question he'd been asked all day. "I think it must be hard to decide what's fair when people disagree about everything," Diego said thoughtfully. "How do you know when you're making the right choice?" Harrison smiled. Not the condescending smile adults give children, but the genuine smile of someone who'd just heard something worth thinking about. That's exactly the right question to ask. The truth is, sometimes you don't know. You just have to listen carefully, consider all the evidence, and make the best decision you can with the information you have. Then you hope you got it right. That conversation sealed Diego's approval of Harrison, though I didn't realize it until later. My son had been watching this man interact with him not as an obstacle to overcome or a miniature adult to impress, but as a person worthy of honest conversation. In Diego's world, that was the highest compliment someone could receive. As Harrison and I grew closer, I found myself sharing pieces of my story I'd never told anyone. Not the sanitized version I gave acquaintances, but the real story, the slow erosion of my self-worth, the years of walking on eggshells, the way Marcus had convinced me that my needs were unreasonable and my feelings were too much. Harrison listened without trying to fix anything, without offering solutions or advice. He just held space for my pain and reminded me that surviving it made me strong, not broken. "Your ex-husband was wrong about you," Harrison said one evening, as we walked through the park near my house. "But I think you already know that." "Most days," I admitted. "Some days I still hear his voice telling me I'm too much work, too complicated, too damaged for anyone to love properly." Harrison stopped walking and turned to face me. The setting sun caught the silver in his hair and made his brown eyes look almost golden. "Isabella, loving you isn't work. It's a privilege, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve access to your heart." I cried then, right there on the walking path with joggers passing by and dog walkers pretending not to stare. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of hearing truth spoken over lies I'd carried for too long. Harrison didn't try to stop my tears or make them go away. He just handed me tissues from his pocket and waited while I let myself feel the relief of being seen clearly by someone who chose to love what he saw. Diego noticed the change in me before I did. "You laugh different now," he told me one morning over breakfast. "Like you're not worried about someone telling you to be quiet." He was right. With Harrison, I laughed loudly and often. I shared opinions without apologizing for having them. I took up space in conversations without constantly checking to make sure I wasn't talking too much. I was remembering what it felt like to be myself without shame or apology. But Marcus noticed the change too, and he didn't like it. The custody exchanges became more tense as Harrison became a bigger part of my life. Marcus would make pointed comments about my new friend, always with air quotes and a smirk that made my skin crawl. He'd ask Diego inappropriate questions about Harrison, fishing for information he could use to make me feel small or uncertain. "So your mom's boyfriend is older, huh?" Marcus said during one particularly uncomfortable handoff. "Hope he knows what he's getting into." Diego's response was swift and sharp. "Mom's happy. That's what matters." But Marcus wasn't done. As months passed and it became clear that Harrison wasn't a rebound or a phase, Marcus's comments became crueler. He'd make jokes about Harrison's patience, wondering aloud how long it would take for him to realize what everyone else already knew, that I was too much work for any reasonable person to handle long-term. These comments hurt, but they hurt differently than they used to. Instead of believing them immediately, I found myself analyzing them, recognizing them as Marcus's pain rather than truth about me. Harrison's love had given me a new lens through which to see Marcus's cruelty, and through that lens, his attacks looked small and desperate rather than powerful and convincing. The proposal happened on a Tuesday, 6 months after our accidental meeting at the community center. Harrison had planned something elaborate involving the botanical gardens and a string quartet, but life had other plans. Diego came home from school with strep throat. I was covered in chicken soup and worry, and Harrison showed up at my door with medicine and groceries without being asked. He found me in the kitchen at midnight, finally sitting down after a day of caring for my sick child, looking like I'd been through a tornado. My hair was in a messy bun, I was wearing old pajamas, and I was pretty sure I had soup stains on my shirt. "This is what I love about you," Harrison said, sitting down across from me at my kitchen table. "You give everything you have to the people you love, and you never complain about it. You just show up every day and make everyone around you feel cared for." Then he got down on one knee right there in my disaster of a kitchen and asked me to marry him with a ring that belonged to his grandmother, and a speech that made me cry happy tears for the second time in our relationship. I said yes, obviously. But what I remember most about that moment wasn't the ring or the proposal. It was the sound of Diego cheering from the top of the stairs, where he'd been listening despite his sore throat and fever. My son's approval meant more to me than any grand gesture ever could. The engagement announcement sent Marcus into a tailspin of anger and hurt that manifested as increased cruelty toward both Diego and me. He couldn't believe that someone like Harrison, successful, respected, genuinely kind, would choose someone like me. His disbelief was so complete that he convinced himself Harrison must be using me for something, though he couldn't figure out what. Marcus's attempts to poison Diego against Harrison backfired spectacularly. The more Marcus criticized my fiancé, the more Diego defended him. The more Marcus insisted that Harrison would eventually leave once he figured out how difficult I was, the more Diego shared stories about Harrison's kindness and consistency. But Marcus wasn't done. He had one more card to play, one final attempt, to prove he was right about my fundamental unworthiness of love. What he didn't know was that Diego had been preparing for this moment for months, watching and waiting and gathering evidence of his own. The confrontation that would change everything was still coming, but first I had to learn that love could be easy. That partnership could feel like support instead of competition. That my voice mattered and my feelings were valid and my dreams were worth pursuing. Harrison didn't just love me despite my past. He helped me understand that my survival and growth made me more lovable, not less. I was finally ready for whatever Marcus had planned, though I had no idea how perfectly Diego was about to handle it for both of us. The confrontation began on a Saturday morning in March, 3 weeks before Harrison and I were supposed to be married. Diego had spent Friday night at Marcus's apartment, their regular custody arrangement that had become increasingly strained as my wedding date approached. Usually Diego would come home quiet and thoughtful after these visits, needing time to decompress from whatever emotional manipulation his father had subjected him to. But this Saturday was different. Diego walked through my front door with the kind of energy I hadn't seen in months. Purposeful, almost electric. He was carrying his backpack and something else. A small digital recorder that I recognized as the one we'd bought him for school projects. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, setting his backpack down with unusual care. "And Harrison should be here for this conversation." Harrison was already on his way over for our Saturday morning coffee ritual, but something in Diego's voice made me call him immediately. "Can you come now instead of in an hour? Diego says it's important." Within 15 minutes, Harrison was sitting at our kitchen table, still in his weekend clothes of jeans and a Georgetown Law sweatshirt, looking between Diego and me with the kind of patient attention that made him such a good judge. Diego had arranged 3 chairs in a triangle like he was convening his own court session. "Before I show you what I have," Diego began, his voice steady but his hands slightly shaking, "I need you both to know that I've been planning this for a while. Dad doesn't know I recorded him, and I know that might be wrong, but I couldn't let him keep saying things about Mom that aren't true." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Diego, whatever you recorded, we'll figure out the ethics of it together, okay? Sometimes protecting the people we love requires difficult choices." My son nodded, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook worn at the edges from being carried around. "I've been keeping track of the things Dad says about Mom. Not just to me, but on the phone, to his friends, to anyone who will listen. I wrote them down because I wanted to remember exactly what he said when the time came to prove he was wrong." Diego opened the notebook and began reading in a clear, strong voice that reminded me of Harrison during court proceedings. March 2nd. Dad told Uncle Rick that Mom was damaged goods, and that Harrison would figure it out eventually. March 8th. Dad said Mom was lucky anyone would put up with her baggage during his phone call with Grandma Rivera. March 12th. Dad told his girlfriend Janet that Mom was playing house with Harrison and it wouldn't last 6 months because some people are just too broken to fix. Each entry was dated, timed, and recorded in Diego's careful handwriting. My son had been documenting his father's cruelty with the precision of a court reporter, building a case I didn't even know needed to be built. There are 43 entries over the past 6 months, Diego continued. But yesterday was different. Yesterday, Dad didn't just talk about Mom. He talked to me directly, and he said things that crossed a line I can't uncross. Diego reached for the digital recorder, his hands steadier now. I need you to hear this, but I need you to know that I'm not the little boy who used to believe everything Dad said. I know who you are, Mom. I know who Harrison is. And I know who Dad is. This recording isn't going to hurt me because I already know the truth. He pressed play, and Marcus's voice filled my kitchen like smoke from a fire I thought we'd extinguished. Diego, sit down. We need to have a man-to-man conversation about your mother and this judge she's planning to marry. Marcus's voice was slurred slightly. He'd been drinking, which explained the loosened tongue and increased cruelty. I don't want to talk about Mom with you, Dad. We've talked about this. No, you're going to listen because somebody needs to prepare you for what's coming. Your mother is about to embarrass herself in the worst possible way, and when it falls apart, and it will fall apart, you're going to be the one picking up the pieces. There was a pause, and I could imagine Diego sitting rigidly in whatever chair Marcus had directed him to, trapped between wanting to defend me and knowing that arguing would only make things worse. This judge, this Harrison, he's not going to stick around. You know why? Because your mother is fundamentally damaged. She's needy, she's clingy, she requires constant validation, and eventually he's going to get tired of managing her emotions. Men like Harrison don't stay with women like your mother. They have their fun. They enjoy the hero complex of saving someone, and then they move on to someone who isn't so much work. Dad, stop. I'm not stopping because you need to understand this. Your mother has convinced herself that she deserves this fairy tale ending, but life doesn't work that way. Broken people don't just get fixed because someone new comes along. She's still the same woman who couldn't handle our marriage, who couldn't handle conflict, who falls apart every time someone expects her to be strong. The recording captured Diego's sharp intake of breath, and I realized my son was reliving this moment as we listened, watching our faces for reactions that might tell him whether his father's words had found their mark. I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen, Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Harrison is going to wake up one morning and realize he's engaged to a woman who can't function without constant reassurance. He's going to notice that every conversation has to revolve around her feelings, her needs, her problems. He's going to get tired of being her therapist instead of her partner. That's not true about Mom. It is true, and deep down, you know it. Remember how she used to cry after our fights? Remember how she'd disappear into her room for hours, leaving you to fend for yourself? Remember how she made everything about her pain, her struggle, her journey? That's who she is, Diego. That's who she'll always be. The cruelty in Marcus's voice was breathtaking, but what struck me more was the calculated nature of it. This wasn't anger speaking. This was purposeful destruction, designed to plant seeds of doubt in his own son's mind about the mother who loved him unconditionally. But Diego wasn't the scared 8-year-old who had once absorbed his father's poison. Without question. Diego was 15 now, with his own experiences and observations to draw from. You're wrong, Dad. And you know you're wrong. I'm trying to protect you from disappointment, son. When this engagement falls apart, it's not going to fall apart. When it falls apart, Marcus repeated louder, your mother is going to become exactly the woman I divorced. Bitter, angry, blaming everyone else for her problems, and you're going to have to live with that. There was silence on the recording, and I could picture Diego calculating his next words, choosing them with the same care Harrison used when crafting legal arguments. Dad, can I tell you what I think is really happening here? What's that? I think you're scared that Mom found someone who actually loves her properly. I think you're scared that Harrison makes her happy in ways you never could. And I think you're trying to convince me she's broken because if she's not broken, then you're just the guy who was too broken to love her right. The silence that followed was deafening. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was tight with rage. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Harrison has never made Mom cry. I know that she laughs more now than she did in the entire last 5 years of your marriage. I know that Harrison asks her about her day and actually listens to the answer. I know that he's never once made her feel small or stupid or like she's asking for too much. Diego? I'm not finished. I know that Mom cooks dinner every night and Harrison thanks her every single time. I know that when Mom talks about her art, Harrison encourages her instead of telling her it's a waste of time. I know that Harrison has never once called her needy or clingy or too much work. Diego's voice was rising slightly, but it remained controlled, factual, devastating in its precision. And I know that the only person who thinks Mom is damaged is the person who did the damaging in the first place. The recording went quiet, except for the sound of ice clinking in what was probably Marcus's third or fourth drink of the evening. You think you understand everything, but you're just a kid. I'm a kid who's been watching both of his parents for 15 years. I'm a kid who remembers what you were like when you were married to Mom, and I'm a kid who can see what Harrison is like now. And the difference is that Harrison actually likes Mom, not just loves her, he likes her. He likes talking to her, spending time with her, hearing her opinions. You never did. Another long pause, filled with the kind of tension that precedes either violence or complete capitulation. When this judge figures out what I already know, Marcus said finally, his voice low and mean, when he realizes that your mother is more work than she's worth, don't come crying to me. I tried to warn both of you. The recording ended there, and the three of us sat in my kitchen in complete silence. Diego closed his notebook and looked at both Harrison and me with eyes that seemed far too mature for his 15 years. I recorded that because I knew someday I'd need proof of who Dad really is, Diego said quietly. Not for me, I figured him out a long time ago, but for other people who might need to understand why I choose Mom and Harrison over him. Harrison reached across the table and took Diego's hand. That took incredible courage, son, and incredible love. I'm tired of letting him lie about Mom, Diego said simply. She's the strongest person I know, and I'm not going to let anyone, not even my own father, make her feel like she's not enough. I was crying again, but this time it was pure pride. My son had just delivered the most powerful defense of my character I'd ever heard, backed by evidence he'd been collecting for months, presented with a maturity that left both Harrison and me speechless. But Diego wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack again and pulled out his phone. There's one more thing, he said. Dad is coming to the wedding. Harrison and I exchanged glances. We hadn't invited Marcus, obviously, but Diego had the right to have his father there if he wanted. I invited him, Diego continued, but not for the reason you think. I invited him because I want him to see Mom marry someone who actually deserves her. I want him to watch Harrison promise to love and honor her in front of everyone we care about. I want him to sit in that church and realize that all his predictions were wrong. Diego looked directly at me, his expression intense and determined. But mostly, Mom, I want him to meet Harrison properly. Not just shake hands at a custody exchange, but really meet him. Because when Dad sees who Harrison actually is, his integrity, his kindness, his reputation, he's going to understand exactly how wrong he's been about your worth. Harrison was nodding slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. You want your father to realize that a federal judge with 30 years of experience, respected by his peers and trusted by the community, wouldn't marry someone unless she was extraordinary. Exactly, Diego said. Dad keeps saying Mom is damaged goods, but damaged goods don't marry federal judges. Dad keeps saying Mom is too much work, but Harrison is one of the busiest, most successful people in Richmond, and he makes time for Mom every single day. Dad keeps saying Mom can't handle a real relationship, but here she is, about to marry someone who could have chosen anyone and chose her. The brilliance of Diego's plan was stunning. He wasn't trying to argue with his father or convince him through words. He was going to let reality speak for itself, let Marcus's own eyes show him how wrong he'd been about everything. The wedding is going to be Dad's education, Diego said with a slight smile, and I'm going to be there to watch him learn. I looked at my son, this remarkable young man who had just outlined a plan to vindicate my worth using nothing but truth and patience, and felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd been afraid of Marcus's judgment, afraid that maybe he was right about my fundamental inadequacy. But seeing myself through Diego's eyes, understanding the evidence he'd compiled of Harrison's genuine love, I finally understood what everyone else had been trying to tell me. I wasn't damaged goods. I wasn't too much work. I wasn't fundamentally flawed or difficult to love. I was a woman who had survived emotional abuse, rebuilt her life, raised an incredible son, and found love with a man who saw my strength instead of my scars. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and Marcus was going to learn exactly who Isabella Martinez really was, not from my words, but from the life I'd built, and the love I'd found, and the son I'd raised to see truth clearly, even when it was uncomfortable. Diego had just handed me the greatest gift a child can give a parent. The absolute certainty that I had been a good mother, that my love had been enough, and that the lies Marcus told about me would never be able to compete with the truth my son had been living with every day. The confrontation at the wedding was going to be epic, but it wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a revelation, orchestrated by a 15-year-old who loved his mother enough to spend months building an unshakable case for her worth. The wedding took place on a perfect April morning at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, a small stone building surrounded by dogwood trees in full bloom. I had chosen this venue not for its grandeur. It seated only 120 people, but for its warmth. The light streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across wooden pews that had witnessed decades of promises and celebrations. This was where I wanted to begin my new life, surrounded by beauty, bathed in light, grounded in something eternal and hopeful. I woke up that morning feeling different than I had on my first wedding day 15 years earlier. Then, I had been nervous, excited, but also trying to convince myself that I was making the right choice despite the nagging doubts I kept pushing aside. Today, I felt peaceful, certain, ready to step into a love that felt like coming home rather than like a performance I needed to perfect. My sister Carmen arrived at 6 in the morning with enough coffee and pastries to feed a small army, along with our cousin Maria, who had flown in from California to do my hair and makeup. They found me already awake, sitting in my kitchen in my robe, drinking tea and watching the sunrise through my window. "How are you feeling, mija?" Carmen asked, settling beside me with her own cup of coffee. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I said, and meant it completely. Diego appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction. "Mom, Harrison just texted. He said he's been awake since 4 because he's too excited to sleep, and he wanted to make sure you know that he's never been more sure of anything in his life." I smiled, picturing Harrison in his own home across town, probably pacing around his kitchen in the methodical way he moved when he was processing big emotions. Text him back and tell him I feel exactly the same way. The morning flowed with the kind of organized chaos that makes the best memories. Carmen directed operations like a seasoned general, coordinating flower deliveries and photographer arrivals, while Maria transformed me into a version of myself that looked like I was glowing from within. The dress I'd chosen was simple but elegant, ivory, silk with delicate lace sleeves, fitted through the bodice and flowing into a skirt that moved like water when I walked. It was nothing like the elaborate princess gown I'd worn for Marcus, and that felt exactly right. Diego disappeared around 10 to get ready at Harrison's house. They'd planned to arrive together, along with Harrison's brother who was serving as best man. This had been Harrison's idea, a way of officially welcoming Diego into our new family structure. He's not just gaining a stepfather, Harrison had told me during one of our late-night planning sessions. I'm gaining a son. We should arrive at the church together, as a family. The guest list was small but meaningful. My side included Carmen and her family, Maria and her husband, a handful of close friends from the community center, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a grandmother to Diego, and surprisingly, my ex-mother-in-law Rosa Rivera, who had called me personally to ask if she could attend. Marcus is my son, and I love him, Rosa had said during that awkward phone conversation. But you are a good woman, Isabella, and you deserve happiness. I want to be there when you find it. Harrison's side included his colleagues from the federal courthouse, his brother's family, several longtime friends, and what seemed like half the volunteers from every charity organization in Richmond. Watching the guest list come together had been a revelation. I had built a community of people who cared about me, respected me, and wanted to celebrate my happiness. Marcus had spent years convincing me that I was isolated and difficult to love, but the evidence suggested otherwise. At 11:30, Carmen helped me into the dress while Maria made final adjustments to my hair. I looked in the full-length mirror and saw someone I recognized but hadn't seen in years. A woman who was confident, radiant, ready to claim her joy without apology. The woman Marcus had tried to convince me I wasn't capable of being. You look beautiful, Bella, Maria said, using my childhood nickname. But more than that, you look happy. Really, truly happy. She was right. The happiness wasn't just in my expression. It was in my posture, in the way I held my shoulders back and my head high, in the way I met my own eyes in the mirror without flinching or looking for flaws to criticize. Carmen handed me my bouquet. White roses mixed with the purple irises that Harrison had learned were my favorite flowers. Ready to go marry your judge? I've been ready for months, I said. Let's do this. The short drive to the church gave me time to think about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I had been a woman who apologized for taking up space, who second-guessed every opinion, who believed that love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection someone was willing to offer. Today, I was marrying a man who not only loved me completely, but respected me deeply, supported my dreams, and cherished the parts of me that Marcus had taught me to hide. We arrived at the church to find the parking lot already full. Through the windows, I could see that every pew was occupied, and people were standing along the walls. The sight made my heart swell with gratitude. All these people had chosen to spend their Saturday morning celebrating love, hope, and new beginnings. But then I saw him. Marcus was standing near the back of the church, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive but somehow didn't quite fit right. He was scanning the crowd with the expression of someone who was looking for something to criticize, some detail that would confirm his predictions about this day ending in disappointment. Carmen noticed my pause. You don't have to do this if you're not ready. We can wait. No, I said firmly. I'm not going to let Marcus's presence steal one moment of joy from this day. He's here because Diego invited him, and Diego invited him for good reasons. I trust my son's judgment completely. The church doors opened and the processional music began. Carmen kissed my cheek and hurried inside to take her seat, leaving me alone in the vestibule with my thoughts and my bouquet and the absolute certainty that I was about to make the best decision of my life. Through the open doors, I could see Harrison waiting at the altar. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a purple tie that matched my irises, and the expression on his face when he saw me was worth every difficult moment that had led to this one. He looked like a man who had just seen a miracle, and maybe he had. The miracle of two people finding each other exactly when they were ready to be found. But what made my heart soar was seeing Diego beside him, serving as both best man and the son who had made this love possible. Diego was wearing a suit identical to Harrison's, and his face was radiant with pride and joy. My son had orchestrated this entire moment, from recording Marcus's cruelty to inviting him to witness my triumph. And now he was standing at the altar, ready to officially welcome the man who had chosen to love both of us. The music swelled, and I began walking down the aisle. Every step felt like a declaration of independence from the woman I used to be. The woman who would have worried about whether her dress looked right, whether people were judging her choices, whether she deserved this happiness. Today, I walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. The congregation rose as I passed, and I could feel their love and support surrounding me like a warm embrace. Mrs. Patterson was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Carmen was beaming like she'd personally arranged this miracle. Harrison's colleagues from the courthouse were smiling with the satisfaction of people who had watched their friend find the happiness he deserved. And Marcus was staring with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not smugness, not superiority. He looked stunned, like he was seeing something that didn't match any of his expectations or predictions. He was watching me walk down the aisle toward a federal judge who was looking at me like I hung the moon, surrounded by a church full of people who had chosen to celebrate my happiness, and nothing about this scene fit the narrative he had constructed about my life. I reached the altar and Harrison took my hands, his eyes never leaving my face. "You are absolutely radiant," he whispered, just loud enough for Diego to hear. "So are you," I whispered back, and meant it. Harrison wasn't just handsome. He was luminous with happiness, with certainty, with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The ceremony began with Pastor Williams welcoming everyone and speaking about the nature of love that endures, love that transforms, love that makes us better versions of ourselves. But I was only half listening to his words because I was too busy absorbing the miracle of this moment. Standing at the altar with a man who saw my strength instead of my scars, surrounded by people who had chosen to support our love, watched over by a son who had fought for my happiness with the fierce loyalty of someone who truly understood my worth. When it came time for the vows, Harrison went first. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, though I suspected he had memorized every word. "Isabella," he began, his voice strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the church. "When I met you at the community center 18 months ago, I thought I was just volunteering to help people study for their citizenship tests. I had no idea I was about to meet the woman who would change everything about how I understood love, partnership, and what it means to build a life with someone." He paused, looking directly into my eyes. "You have taught me that real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose particular brand of imperfection matches yours so perfectly that together you create something beautiful and strong and whole." I could hear people in the congregation murmuring appreciatively, but I was focused entirely on Harrison's face, on the absolute sincerity in his voice, on the way he was speaking these words like they were the most important ones he'd ever said. "You have survived things that would have broken weaker people, and instead of becoming bitter or guarded, you became kinder, more compassionate, more determined to create beauty in the world. You volunteer your time to help others. You raise an extraordinary son with wisdom and grace, and you love with a generosity that takes my breath away." Harrison's voice grew stronger, more declarative. "I promise to love you not in spite of your past, but because your past created the incredible woman standing before me today. I promise to support your dreams, celebrate your victories, and stand beside you through whatever challenges life brings. I promise to never take for granted the gift of your love, your trust, or your partnership." He looked briefly toward the congregation, and I realized he was looking at Marcus, making sure my ex-husband heard every word of what came next. Most importantly, I promise to see you clearly. Your strength, your beauty, your worth, every single day for the rest of our lives. You are not damaged goods, Isabella. You are a treasure, and I am the luckiest man alive because you chose to share your life with me. The church was completely silent except for the sound of people dabbing their eyes. I was crying too, but they were tears of pure joy, of recognition, of finally hearing someone speak the truth about who I was, with absolute conviction and complete public commitment. When it was my turn, I didn't need to look at notes. The words came straight from my heart. Harrison, you saved my life, but not in the way people usually mean that phrase. You didn't rescue me from anything external. You rescued me from my own doubts about whether I was worthy of real love. You showed me what partnership looks like when both people are committed to building each other up instead of tearing each other down. I could see Diego nodding encouragingly, and it gave me the courage to speak even more boldly. You love me loudly and proudly, without shame or hesitation. You introduce me to your friends and colleagues with pride. You ask for my opinions and actually listen to my answers. You make me feel like my thoughts matter, my dreams are valid, and my love is a gift rather than a burden. I was speaking to Harrison, but I was also speaking to everyone in that church, including Marcus. This was my declaration of independence, my public claiming of my own worth. I promise to love you with the same generosity and courage you've shown me. I promise to support your career, celebrate your achievements, and stand beside you as an equal partner in everything we build together. I promise to never settle for less than the extraordinary love we've found, and to never let anyone convince me that I don't deserve every bit of happiness we create. Pastor Williams led us through the traditional vows, and we exchanged rings, simple gold bands that felt substantial and permanent on our fingers. When he pronounced us husband and wife and invited Harrison to kiss his bride, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the rafters of the small church. But the moment that will stay with me forever happened during the recessional. As Harrison and I walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I caught sight of Marcus near the back of the church. He was no longer looking stunned or skeptical. He looked defeated, like he had just watched his entire worldview crumble in real time. Because what had Marcus just witnessed? He had watched his ex-wife, the woman he had spent years calling damaged goods, marry a federal judge in a ceremony filled with love, respect, and celebration. He had watched that same woman speak with confidence and joy about her worth and her future. He had seen her son stand proudly beside her new husband, clearly choosing this new family over loyalty to his biological father. But most importantly, Marcus had been forced to confront the reality that a man like Harrison Montgomery, successful, respected, admired by his peers and his community, had chosen me. Not as a charity case or a temporary distraction, but as a partner worthy of his love, his commitment, and his name. As we reached the back of the church, Diego appeared beside us, grinning broadly. How does it feel to be married to a federal judge, Mom? It feels like coming home, I said, and I meant it completely. The reception was held at Harrison's country club, a decision that had initially made me nervous. But Harrison had insisted, and I understood why when we arrived. He wanted to celebrate our marriage in the place where he conducted business, where his professional reputation mattered most, where everyone would see that he had chosen me as his partner in every aspect of his life. The reception was everything a wedding celebration should be, filled with laughter, dancing, heartfelt toasts, and the kind of joy that spills over and touches everyone present. But the moment that mattered most came during the father-son dance. Because Diego didn't dance with Marcus. Diego danced with Harrison, and as they moved across the dance floor, they talked quietly about something that made them both smile. When the song ended, Diego hugged his new stepfather and said something that made Harrison's eyes fill with tears. Later, I learned what Diego had said. "Thank you for showing me what it looks like when a man really loves my mom." Marcus left. Before the cake was cut, slipping out without saying goodbye to anyone, including Diego. But his absence didn't diminish the celebration. If anything, it felt like the final piece of my liberation. Marcus could no longer cast a shadow over my happiness because my happiness was too bright, too real, too well supported by everyone who mattered. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the woman who apologized for taking up space, who accepted scraps of affection, who believed that love meant suffering in silence. I was Isabella Montgomery now, married to a man who cherished me, mother to a son who had fought for my happiness, surrounded by a community that celebrated my joy. As Harrison and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, I whispered in his ear, "Marcus was wrong about everything, wasn't he?" Harrison pulled back to look at me, his eyes sparkling with love and mischief. "Spectacularly wrong, but I'm grateful for his mistakes, because they led you to me." That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband in our new shared home, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the broken woman who had accepted emotional abuse as normal, to the divorced mother rebuilding her life one day at a time, to the confident woman who had just married a federal judge, surrounded by love and celebration. The story Marcus had tried to write about my life, the one where I was damaged goods destined for loneliness, had been completely rewritten. Not by anger or revenge, but by truth, by growth, by the patient love of good people, and by my own decision to believe that I deserved better. Diego had been right about everything. Marcus's cruelty had been exposed not through confrontation, but through contrast. The difference between a man who tried to diminish me and a man who celebrated me was so stark that no one could miss it, including Marcus himself. I was finally free, finally whole, finally home. And the best part was knowing that this was just the beginning of the story I was going to write with Harrison, the story Diego had made possible by refusing to let anyone convince him that his mother was anything less than extraordinary. The months following our wedding brought changes I never could have anticipated. Marriage to Harrison wasn't just about finding love. It opened doors to a world I had never imagined myself inhabiting. As the wife of a respected federal judge, I was suddenly invited to charity galas, legal conferences, and community events where my presence mattered, not because I was someone's accessory, but because I was recognized as a partner to someone whose work made a difference. The first major event was the Richmond Bar Association's annual fundraiser for legal aid services. Harrison had been asked to give the keynote address, and as we prepared for the evening, I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety about being in a room full of accomplished professionals. But Harrison sensed my nervousness and took my hands as we stood in our bedroom, both of us in formal attire. "Isabella, I need you to understand something," he said, adjusting my diamond necklace, a wedding gift from his mother. "You're not attending this event as my wife who happens to be there. You're attending as someone who has spent years providing essential services to underserved communities. Half the people in that room do pro bono work once a month. You do community service every week, and you've been doing it since before you met me." He was right, but I had never thought of my volunteer work as equivalent to the legal careers surrounding us. Harrison helped me see that my contributions to the citizenship classes, the community center programming, and the local food bank weren't just nice gestures. They were the foundation of civil society, the work that made democracy possible at the ground level. That night, I found myself in conversations with district attorneys, public defenders, and family court judges who were genuinely interested in my perspective on community needs. When I mentioned the challenges facing new immigrants in navigating basic legal processes, 3 different attorneys asked for my contact information to discuss potential partnerships. By the end of the evening, I had been invited to serve on 2 nonprofit boards and had been asked to consider applying for a position with the city's Immigrant Services Department. "How did that feel?" Harrison asked as we drove home, my head still spinning from the evening's conversations. "Like I belonged there," I admitted. "Not because I'm married to you, but because I actually had something valuable to contribute." "Now you're beginning to understand what I saw in you from the very first day," Harrison said with a smile. This was the gift Harrison had given me that I hadn't fully appreciated until that night. He had never treated my community work as a hobby or a way to fill time. He had always spoken about it with the same respect he gave to his judicial responsibilities, as if what I did mattered just as much as what he did. Through his eyes, I began to see myself as someone whose work had value, whose opinions carried weight, whose presence in professional spaces was earned rather than borrowed. Diego was thriving in ways that amazed me daily. With the stability of Harrison's presence in our lives and the end of Marcus's psychological manipulation, my son had blossomed into a confident, articulate young man who seemed to grow more insightful by the week. He had started a podcast called Real Talk with Real Teens, where he interviewed other students about their experiences with divorce, blended families, and finding their voices in difficult situations. The podcast had gained a surprising following, with guidance counselors from several schools reaching out to ask Diego to speak to their students. Listening to him record episodes, I was struck by his maturity and wisdom. He had taken his own painful experiences and transformed them into a platform for helping other teenagers navigate similar challenges. "Mom, I got an email from a girl in California," Diego told me one evening as we prepared dinner together. She said that hearing my story about standing up to Dad helped her find the courage to tell her school counselor about her stepfather's emotional abuse. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at my son, who was now 16 and nearly as tall as Harrison. "How does that make you feel?" "Like maybe everything we went through wasn't just about us," he said thoughtfully. "Like maybe our story can help other people write better endings to their own stories." That perspective, that our pain could become a source of healing for others, had become a central theme in Diego's worldview. He was planning to study psychology in college with the goal of becoming a family therapist who specialized in helping children cope with parental manipulation and emotional abuse. Meanwhile, Marcus had essentially disappeared from our lives. After the wedding, his already irregular contact with Diego became even more sporadic. He would go weeks without calling, then send long text messages full of justifications for his absence and promises to do better that never materialized. Diego had stopped making excuses for his father's behavior and had begun responding to these messages with simple, factual responses that neither encouraged nor criticized. "I'm not angry at Dad anymore," Diego told me during one of our evening walks. "I feel sorry for him. He could have had a relationship with both of us, but he chose his ego over his family. That's not something I did to him. That's something he did to himself." The wisdom in this 17-year-old's words took my breath away. Diego had learned to separate his father's choices from his own worth, something that had taken me decades to understand. He had recognized that Marcus's rejection was not a reflection of Diego's value as a son, but of Marcus's limitations as a father. Harrison formally adopted Diego on his 18th birthday, a process that involved more paperwork than emotion, since Diego had been calling him Dad for over a year. Marcus didn't contest the adoption. In fact, he didn't respond to the legal notices at all. When the judge declared the adoption final, Diego hugged Harrison and whispered, "Now it's official. You're stuck with me forever." "That's exactly how I want it," Harrison replied, and I saw tears in both their eyes. The adoption was more than a legal formality. It was Diego's conscious choice to align himself with the family that had chosen to love and support him, rather than the biological connection that had brought him pain. Watching them embrace in that courtroom, I realized that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who show up consistently, who support your growth, who celebrate your victories and comfort you through your struggles. My own career had taken an unexpected turn as well. The conversations from that first Bar Association event had led to a part-time position with Richmond's Office of New Americans, where I developed programming to help recent immigrants navigate everything from school enrollment to small business licensing. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways that reminded me of my art therapy background. I was helping people process trauma, adjust to new circumstances, and build lives that reflected their hopes rather than their fears. Harrison was my biggest supporter in this new role, often helping me think through complex cases or providing insights from his judicial experience. Our evening conversations had become collaborative problem-solving sessions where we pooled our knowledge to help the families I was working with. I had become not just Harrison's wife, but his intellectual partner, someone whose work complemented and enhanced his own. "You know what I love most about your new job?" Harrison said one evening as we reviewed a particularly difficult case involving a family whose asylum claim had been denied. "What's that?" "You're doing exactly what you did for Diego and me. You're helping people rewrite their stories. You're showing them that their past doesn't have to determine their future, that they have the power to create something better." He was right. Whether I was helping a teenager understand that their parents' emotional abuse wasn't their fault, or helping a refugee family navigate the complex process of building a new life in America, the core message was the same. You are not limited by what has happened to you. You have the power to write a different ending. This realization led to my next project, a memoir about emotional recovery and the power of choosing your own family. The book, titled Rewriting the Story, A Journey from Survival to Thriving, became a local bestseller and led to speaking engagements at women's conferences, divorce recovery groups, and parenting workshops. The first time I stood on a stage in front of 300 women at a conference about recovering from emotional abuse, I thought about the woman I had been just 5 years earlier, someone who apologized for taking up space, who believed that her pain was evidence of her inadequacy, who couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hear her story. "I used to think that surviving abuse made me damaged goods," I told the audience. "But I've learned that surviving abuse made me strong, wise, and compassionate in ways I never could have been otherwise. Our scars are not evidence of our brokenness, they're evidence of our resilience." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause. It was recognition, validation from hundreds of women who saw their own journeys reflected in mine. After the event, dozens of women approached me with their own stories, asking for advice, sharing their struggles, celebrating their victories. That night, as I called Harrison to tell him about the response to my speech, he said something that made me understand how completely my life had transformed. "Isabella, do you realize that you've become exactly the woman you were meant to be? Not despite what Marcus did to you, but because of how you chose to respond to it. You took his attempts to diminish you and turned them into fuel for helping other people find their strength." He was right. Marcus had tried to write a story about me that ended with loneliness and defeat. Instead, I had written a story about transformation, resilience, and the power of choosing love over fear. My marriage to Harrison wasn't the ending of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter where I used my voice, my experience, and my platform to help other people rewrite their own narratives. Diego's podcast had grown to over 50,000 subscribers, and he had been invited to speak at a national conference about youth advocacy. Watching him present his research on the long-term effects of parental emotional abuse to an audience of professional counselors and social workers, I felt a pride that was different from typical parental pride. This wasn't just about my son's accomplishments. It was about witnessing someone transform their pain into purpose, their trauma into advocacy. "My mom taught me that we get to choose how our stories end," Diego said during his presentation. "She showed me that we don't have to accept other people's definitions of our worth, even when those people are supposed to love us unconditionally. Especially then." After his presentation, a clinical psychologist approached Diego to discuss The possibility of co-authoring a research paper about adolescent resilience in the face of parental emotional abuse. My 18-year-old son was being invited to contribute to academic research because his insights, born from his own experience and his commitment to helping others, had value that extended far beyond his age. The transformation of our little family was complete, but it was also ongoing. We had learned that healing isn't a destination. It's a continuous process of choosing growth over stagnation, love over fear, truth over convenient lies. Every day brought new opportunities to live out the lessons we had learned, to model healthy relationships for other people, to use our voices to advocate for those who were still finding theirs. Marcus remained a distant figure in our lives. Someone Diego would mention occasionally in the context of scheduled phone calls that rarely happened or promised visits that were usually canceled. But Marcus's absence no longer created a void in Diego's life. It simply left more space for the relationships that were nurturing and supportive. "I used to think Dad's approval was something I needed," Diego told me during one of our regular coffee dates, a tradition we had maintained even as he prepared for college. "Now I realize that his approval isn't worth having if it requires me to pretend that his treatment of you was acceptable." This was perhaps the most profound victory of all, raising a son who understood that love without respect isn't love at all, that real men don't diminish the women in their lives. That true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Diego would enter his adult relationships with a clear understanding of what healthy love looked like, and he would never accept anything less for himself or offer anything less to his partners. As for Harrison and me, our marriage had settled into the kind of partnership I had once thought existed only in movies. We supported each other's careers, shared household responsibilities without keeping score, and maintained the kind of friendship that made us genuinely enjoy each other's company. We had disagreements, of course, but they were negotiations between equals rather than power struggles where someone had to win and someone had to lose. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Diego hadn't recorded that conversation with Marcus? Harrison asked me one evening as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Sometimes," I admitted. But then I remember that Diego's recording didn't create the truth. It just documented what was already true. Marcus's cruelty was real whether or not it was recorded. My worth was real whether or not he acknowledged it. Your love for me was real whether or not Marcus understood it. "So you think we would have found our way to this happiness anyway?" "I think we would have found our way to truth anyway," I said. "And truth always leads to the right kind of happiness eventually." That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I thought about the woman I had been when this story began. Someone who had accepted emotional scraps as love, who had believed that her pain was evidence of her inadequacy, who had raised a son while believing that she was fundamentally flawed. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth, who demanded respect as well as love, who had learned that the right person would see her strength rather than her scars. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. And it hadn't happened because of Harrison's love alone. It had happened because I had chosen to believe that I deserved better, because Diego had refused to let me accept less than I was worth, and because I had done the hard work of rebuilding my sense of self from the ground up. Marcus had been wrong about everything, about my worth, about my future, about my capacity to love and be loved. But more importantly, I had been wrong about myself for far too long. The greatest victory wasn't proving Marcus wrong. It was discovering that I had never needed his approval or anyone else's to be whole, valuable, and worthy of extraordinary love. My story had been rewritten, not by changing the past, but by refusing to let the past define the future. And now, every day, I had the privilege of helping other people rewrite their own stories, one conversation, one workshop, one moment of recognition at a time. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space was now taking up stages, speaking to audiences, writing books, and raising a son who would never question his right to be loved properly. That transformation was the real miracle. Not finding love, but remembering that I had always been worthy of it. 2 years into our marriage, life presented us with an unexpected opportunity that would test everything we had built together. Harrison was offered a position on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most prestigious appointments in the federal judiciary. The position would require us to relocate to a different city, and more significantly, it would thrust our family into a much more public spotlight than we had ever experienced. The evening Harrison received the call from the White House personnel office, we sat in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Diego had once played that devastating recording, and discussed what this opportunity would mean for all of us. The appointment would require Senate confirmation hearings, FBI background checks, and intense scrutiny of every aspect of our lives, including my past marriage and divorce. "They're going to dig into everything," Harrison explained, his voice calm but serious. "My judicial record, our finances, our families, our backgrounds. They'll interview former colleagues, neighbors, even people we went to school with decades ago. Are you prepared for that level of examination?" I looked at this man who had transformed my understanding of love and partnership, who was now offering to turn down one of the highest honors in his profession if I wasn't comfortable with the scrutiny it would bring. 3 years earlier, the thought of strangers examining my past would have terrified me. Now, it felt like an opportunity to demonstrate how completely I had reclaimed my story. "Harrison, I spent years hiding from my own truth because I was ashamed of what happened to me," I said, reaching across the table to take his hands. "But shame belongs to the person who chooses cruelty, not to the person who survives it. If they want to examine my past, they're going to find a woman who rebuilt her life, raised an extraordinary son, and found the courage to love again. I'm proud of that story." Diego, now a sophomore at University of Virginia studying psychology and political science, was equally supportive when we called to tell him about the potential appointment. "Dad, this is incredible," he said, using the title that still made Harrison's eyes light up every time he heard it. "And Mom, you know what this means? Your story is going to become part of the public record. Other women who are going through what you went through will be able to see that abuse doesn't disqualify you from anything. It makes you stronger and wiser." The confirmation process began 6 months later, and it was every bit as thorough as Harrison had predicted. FBI agents interviewed dozens of people from our past and present, including several of my former neighbors, colleagues from the community center, and even some of Diego's teachers. The background investigation stretched back decades, examining everything from Harrison's college grades to my volunteer work to our tax returns. The most challenging part came when they interviewed Marcus. I learned about this from the FBI agent assigned to our case, who mentioned that my ex-husband had been contacted as part of their standard procedure for interviewing family members of nominees' spouses. My stomach dropped when I heard this. Not because I was afraid of what Marcus might say about me, but because I knew he would see this as an opportunity to cause damage. "What did he tell them?" I asked the agent, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't discuss the specific content of interviews," Agent Rodriguez replied diplomatically. "But I can tell you that we interview multiple sources about every aspect of a nominee's background. One person's perspective doesn't determine our findings." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake imagining Marcus sitting across from federal agents, finally having an audience for all his theories about my fundamental inadequacy. I pictured him explaining how I was difficult to live with, how I required too much emotional maintenance, how I would be a liability to Harrison's career. The old fears that I thought I had conquered came creeping back in the darkness. Harrison found me at 3 a.m, sitting in our living room with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, settling beside me on the couch. "I'm thinking that Marcus finally has the perfect audience. For all his lies about me," I admitted. "Federal agents who have the power to end your career before it reaches its full potential." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, Then he took my hand. Isabella, do you remember what you told me when I first asked you to marry me? You said that you were tired of letting other people's opinions of you determine your worth. You said you were ready to write your own story. I remember. Then trust the story you've written. Trust the life you've built, the work you've done, the relationships you've created. Trust that the truth is stronger than Marcus's bitterness. He was right, of course. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. And I spent the next few weeks battling anxiety about what Marcus might have said and how it might affect Harrison's confirmation. The answer came in an unexpected way. Agent Rodriguez called to schedule a follow-up interview with me, which she explained was standard procedure. When I arrived at the federal building downtown, I was prepared for questions about my marriage, to Marcus, about the circumstances of our divorce, about anything that might be seen as potentially damaging to Harrison's reputation. Instead, Agent Rodriguez surprised me by saying, "Mrs. Montgomery, we've completed our background investigation, and I wanted to discuss some of the themes that emerged from our interviews about you." Themes? In 30 years of conducting these investigations, I've rarely seen such consistent positive feedback about someone's character. Every person we interviewed, from your former neighbors to your current colleagues to people who've known you for decades, described you as kind, resilient, dedicated, and principled. Even your ex-husband's interview ultimately reinforced these qualities. I blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry. What?" Agent Rodriguez consulted her notes. "Mr. Rivera did make some critical comments about your marriage, but when pressed for specific examples of concerning behavior, he couldn't provide any. Instead, he inadvertently painted a picture of someone who prioritized her child's well-being, who worked hard to maintain stability during a difficult time, and who handled divorce proceedings with dignity despite significant provocation." She looked up from her file. What stood out to our team was that Mr. Rivera's criticism seemed to stem from resentment rather than legitimate concerns about your character or judgment. In contrast, everyone else we interviewed spoke about your integrity, your service to others, and your positive influence on Judge Montgomery and your son. I sat in stunned silence as Agent Rodriguez continued. "One of your former neighbors, Mrs. Patterson, told us that she watched you go through your divorce and rebuild your life with grace and determination that inspired her to make positive changes in her own life. Your colleagues at the Office of DUI, New Americans, described you as one of the most effective advocates they've ever worked with. Your son's teachers uniformly described you as a parent who prioritized his emotional well-being above all else." The irony was almost overwhelming. Marcus's attempt to damage my reputation during the FBI investigation had backfired completely. His inability to provide specific examples of actual wrongdoing had only highlighted the contrast between his resentment and everyone else's respect for my character. "There is one thing I'd like to ask you about directly," Agent Rodriguez continued. "We understand that your son recorded a conversation with his father approximately 3 years ago. Can you tell us about that situation?" This was the moment I had been dreading, but sitting there in that sterile federal building, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Diego's recording wasn't evidence of family dysfunction. It was evidence of a child's courage in the face of emotional manipulation. I told Agent Rodriguez the whole story. Marcus's escalating cruelty after my engagement, Diego's decision to document his father's behavior, the conversation that revealed the depth of Marcus's bitterness, and how that recording had ultimately freed both Diego and me from the last vestiges of Marcus's psychological control. "My son didn't record his father to hurt him," I explained. "He recorded him to protect me from continuing to believe lies about my own worth. That recording was an act of love, not revenge." Agent Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That aligns with everything else we've learned about your family dynamics. Judge Montgomery's colleagues describe him as a man whose judgment and character they trust completely, and they attribute much of his personal happiness and professional effectiveness to his partnership with you. Your son is described by his Professors and peers as unusually mature, principled, and focused on helping others, qualities that typically reflect strong parenting. The confirmation hearings themselves were held 6 weeks later, and I sat in the gallery watching Harrison answer questions from senators about his judicial philosophy, his approach to constitutional interpretation, and his vision for the appellate court. The questions were tough but respectful, and Harrison's responses demonstrated the wisdom, integrity, and careful reasoning that had made me fall in love with him. During a break in the proceedings, Senator Williams, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, approached me in the hallway. "Mrs. Montgomery, I wanted to tell you that your husband's background investigation was one of the most impressive we've seen. The FBI's report painted a picture of a man of exceptional character, and much of that seems to be attributed to the stability and partnership you've provided." She paused, then added, "I also want you to know that several members of this committee have read your book about recovery from emotional abuse. Your work has helped a lot of people, and it reflects the kind of character we want to see in the families of our federal judges." Harrison was confirmed by a vote of 78-22, a strong bipartisan endorsement that reflected the respect he had earned throughout his career. As we celebrated that evening with Diego and close friends, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that night when I first overheard Marcus's cruel predictions about my future. Marcus had said I would never find real love, that I was too damaged for anyone to want me long-term, that I would end up alone and bitter. Instead, I had married a man who was now one of the most respected jurists in the country, a man who credited our partnership as a source of strength in his professional life. The move to our new city brought fresh opportunities for all of us. Harrison's new position on the Court of Appeals was challenging and fulfilling, involving complex constitutional questions that often had nationwide implications. I was offered a position as Director of Family Services for a major immigrant rights organization, work that allowed me to develop policy and advocate at levels I had never imagined possible. Diego transferred to Georgetown University to be closer to our new home, and he immediately became involved in student government and advocacy work. His podcast had evolved into a platform for discussing social justice issues, and he had been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the long-term impacts of childhood emotional abuse. "Mom, do you realize what's happening?" Diego asked me during one of our regular coffee dates in our new city. "Dad spent years trying to convince everyone that you were a burden, that you would hold people back, that you weren't worthy of respect. But look at us now. Harrison is on one of the most important courts in the country. You're shaping immigration policy, and I'm testifying before Congress. We're not just surviving, we're thriving at levels that most people never reach." He was right. The family that Marcus had tried to diminish and divide had become a force for positive change in the world. Harrison's judicial decisions were already being cited by other courts for their clarity and wisdom. My work was helping to shape how the nation approached immigration and refugee services. Diego's advocacy was influencing how mental health professionals understood and treated the effects of parental emotional abuse. But perhaps the most satisfying development came 2 years after Harrison's confirmation, when I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Dr. Patricia Reeves, a family therapist who had been following my work and Diego's advocacy. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm calling because I have a situation that I think you might be uniquely qualified to help with," she said. "I'm working with a woman who's going through a difficult divorce. Her ex-husband has been engaging in a systematic campaign to undermine her confidence and her relationship with their teenage son. The patterns you describe in your book are textbook examples of what this family is experiencing." Dr. Reeves explained that the woman, Sarah, was struggling to help her son understand his father's manipulative behavior without alienating him from his father entirely. The parallels to my own experience were striking, but what made this situation particularly meaningful was that Sarah had specifically asked to speak with me after reading my book. She said that your story gave her hope that this situation could have a positive outcome that her son could learn to see the truth without losing his relationship with his father entirely. Would you be willing to speak with her? That conversation with Sarah led to another, and then another. Soon, I was regularly consulting with therapists, divorce attorneys, and family court judges about cases involving parental emotional manipulation. My personal experience, combined with my professional background in counseling and my current work in family services, had created a unique expertise that was in high demand. Within a year, I had co-founded the Center for Family Recovery, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families heal from emotional abuse and manipulation. The center provided counseling services, educational programs for legal professionals, and advocacy training for teenagers who, like Diego, found themselves caught between loyalty to a parent and the need to protect themselves and their other parent from psychological harm. Diego became the center's first youth ambassador, traveling to conferences and training sessions to share his story and teach other young people how to recognize and respond to parental manipulation. His message was always the same. You can. Love someone and still refuse to accept their lies about other people you love. Loyalty to family doesn't mean accepting abuse from family. The center's work caught national attention when we published research showing that children who learned to identify and resist parental emotional manipulation developed stronger relationship skills, higher self-esteem, and greater resilience than their peers. Diego's story became a case study in how young people could navigate family dysfunction while maintaining their own emotional health. 3 years after the center's founding, I was invited to testify before a congressional committee about the need for better training for family court personnel in recognizing and addressing parental alienation and emotional abuse. As I sat at the witness table, looking out at the senators and representatives who would help shape national policy on these issues, I thought about the woman I had been just 7 years earlier, someone who apologized for having opinions, who believed her pain was evidence of her inadequacy, who couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hear her voice. The cycle of emotional abuse continues when we fail to recognize it, when we normalize it, when we teach children that love requires accepting disrespect, I told the committee. But when we give children the tools to recognize manipulation, when we teach them that real love builds up rather than tears down, we break those cycles forever. After my testimony, Congressman Martinez approached me with tears in his eyes. My daughter went through something similar with her ex-husband, he said. Your center's work gave her the strength to protect herself and her children. You've saved my family, and I know you've saved thousands of others. That evening, as Harrison, Diego, and I had dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol, I marveled at the journey that had brought us to this moment. We were a family that had been forged in the fire of adversity, strengthened by truth-telling, and united by a shared commitment to helping others find their own strength. Do you ever wonder what Marcus thinks about all this? Diego asked, gesturing around the restaurant where we were celebrating my testimony before Congress. Honestly, I rarely think about him at all anymore, I admitted. His opinion of me has become completely irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. Harrison raised his glass. To Isabella Montgomery, federal appellate judge's wife, nationally recognized advocate, best-selling author, devoted mother, and the strongest woman I know. Marcus couldn't have been more wrong about anything if he had tried. As we toasted, to the life we had built together, I realized that Marcus's greatest gift to me had been his underestimation of my potential. His conviction that I was damaged goods had motivated me to prove otherwise, not to him, but to myself. His prediction that I would never find real love had made me recognize authentic love when it appeared. His attempts to diminish me had ultimately revealed my own strength. The woman who had once hidden in her kitchen while her husband mocked her to his friends was now speaking truth to power in the halls of Congress. The son who had once felt helpless watching his father's cruelty was now empowering other young people to find their voices. The family that had once been defined by dysfunction was now a source of healing for thousands of others. Marcus's story about us had been completely rewritten, not through revenge, but through resilience, not through anger, but through authenticity, not through bitterness, but through the determination to transform pain into purpose. And the most beautiful part of all was knowing that our story was still being written, one day of choosing love over fear at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.